Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. This is part 4 and the final part in this Waco cult series, and I would say the most important part. Here we'll discuss everything that happened at the end, certain themes that seem to run throughout, and the implications that rippled outwards. First, I want to have a quick word from our sponsor, and our sponsor for today's video is Ana Luisa Jewelry. Now, if you've seen all of the other parts of the series, every single time I've been wearing an Ana Luisa piece, I believe the first time I was wearing the Zadok necklace, which was the little golden honeycomb. If you've been following me for a while, you know I've been wanting that necklace forever, and I have on this necklace today, and this is the Brook necklace from Ana Luisa Jewelry. Ana Luisa sells beautiful jewelry with a beautiful backstory. They are sustainable, responsible, and transparent. They use sustainable materials in their jewelry. So they use 14 karat gold, but it's recycled. They don't want to go to the earth and mine more when there's plenty that's already been mined. They give you the same high quality luxury jewelry without that incredibly high retail markup. I've loved every single piece I've ever gotten from Ana Luisa Jewelry, and I know that these pieces are going to be staples in my wardrobe for a long time, but they're also statement pieces. All the stuff that they have on there is very original, very different than anything I've seen anywhere else. With Christmas around the corner, you may be looking for a really nice gift for somebody, your mother, your mother-in-law, your sister, your best friend, and you want to give them something that shows you know who they are, and you've put thought into it, and you want them to have something nice that's going to last them a very long time. And this is not cheaply made jewelry. As long as you polish it every once in a while and store them properly, they will last forever. They don't tarnish, they don't scratch. I've worn them in the shower. I accidentally put lotion all over them when I get out of the shower, and afterwards I just take a little polishing cloth, polish them up, and they look good as new. So check out the link in my description box. I do believe they're having a holiday sale right now. It looks like there's free shipping to the United States. And I want to give a big thank you to Ana Luisa for sponsoring this video, and a big thank you to you guys for being here, watching the video, watching the sponsor, and trusting that I will never suggest something to you that I don't 100% believe in and back up myself. Let's move on to the video. There's going to be some things in this video that will upset you. I'm just going to tell you that right off the bat. This isn't a trigger warning because I trust that you guys are responsible adults and you watch these sort of things understanding that there are going to be some things that upset you. While I was researching it, while I was writing my notes, while I was reading about it, it upset me. But as always, I will be as respectful and sensitive as possible, just giving you enough to understand the story without going into grotesque detail. According to a document released by the United States Justice Department, in the wake of the Mount Carmel tragedy, the FBI's strategy had been to secure the surrender and arrest all adult occupants of the compound while providing the maximum possible security for the children located within the compound. However, they weren't certain whether David Koresh actually believed his own message or whether he was exploiting his control over the Branch Davidians. Myself, I've always wondered if he was almost using these people as a human shield. Maybe he did want to draw the FBI into a war with him to fulfill his prophecy. Or maybe he didn't really think that they would do anything to him while the children remained inside, and he could use this to buy time and figure out what he was going to do next. Even though Koresh believed in the law of God, allegedly, he still was familiar with the law of man, and he knew that as soon as he surrendered, he was going to be arrested, and he'd be arrested for the murder of the 4 ATF agents who died on February 28th. And the FBI negotiators had been on the phone with Koresh for this 51 days, trying to convince him that the FBI was not going to be his instrument to fulfill this prophecy. The FBI wasn't going to be a part of proving to his people, his followers, that he was who he said he was. And they'd brought in all of these religious and psychological experts in order to help them do this. But Koresh would change his religious framework as he went. And if anyone he was talking to found an inconsistency or a hypocrisy in his preachings, he would just switch it up to make whatever he was saying fit whatever his narrative was at that point. Therefore, there was no way to reason with him, to get through to him, or to ever make him concede or admit to being wrong about anything. This same document touches on the power struggle between the FBI negotiators and the FBI tactical team, or the HRT, with the tactical team oftentimes exerting pressure on the Branch Davidians without the knowledge of the FBI negotiators, sometimes doing so when the FBI negotiators explicitly told them not to. The negotiators believed that every time the tactical team did something like cut the power or start destroying the cars, they were pushing back the progress that the negotiators had made with the Branch Davidians, the trust that the negotiators had gained from the Branch Davidians. And this show of force on behalf of the agents on the tactical team was really frowned on by the negotiators. It was the negotiators' belief that because these two groups of FBI agents were never on the same page, the Branch Davidians lost faith that the negotiators had any power at all. It's here that we see the glaring problem in the FBI's handling of the situation with David Koresh and the Branch Davidians, almost as bad, if not worse, than the ATFs. The negotiators were there for a reason, and they should have been able to do their job without roadblocks being placed in front of them every time they turned around by people who were supposed to be on their same team. And it appears that there are many on the tactical team, those who were higher up and kind of running the show, who didn't believe that David Koresh was even working on a manuscript for the Seven Seals. On April 17th, when they were talking to Steve Schneider on the phone, they asked him how the work was coming on the manuscript. Was he almost done? How far along was he? And Steve Schneider allegedly said that he hadn't even seen it. However, the bugs, the recording devices that had been placed inside the Branch Davidian compound when the FBI sent in milk crates, they had picked up the Branch Davidians clearly talking about David working on his manuscript, how he wanted to write it all by hand, which they thought was a waste of time, and it would take much too long. So in reality, the FBI knew that Koresh at least was working on his project, even if they didn't know when he would be done with it or they didn't have an exact completion date. On April 18th, the FBI tanks came in and destroyed a vintage El Camino that was on the compound and David Koresh's own Camaro, which really inflamed him, I think, almost more than anything else that had happened. David gets on the phone with the negotiator and he says, "You're going to place this day in the history books as one of the saddest days in the world." And the FBI negotiators and the FBI hostage rescue team, HRT, the tactical team, they once again butt heads and they have this showdown. The negotiators tell the tactical team that using tear gas is a really bad idea, but once again, these two groups of FBI agents were not on the same page. They were never on the same page. And the HRT had run out of patience. They'd already gotten the green light from Janet Reno to go ahead with the tear gas attack, and these negotiators weren't going to tell them otherwise. Reno had approved the assault to begin on April 19th and had planned for it to last 48 hours. It would span over 48 hours, 2 days, because the initial plan was a gradual insertion of this tear gas. So basically, they weren't just going to go in, tear gas guns blazing, shove all the tear gas in, and then walk away and see what happened. They were going to insert it gradually. A step-by-step process of putting that gas in the building slowly so it would give people an opportunity to come out. This, however, would not be the end result, and the gas attack wouldn't last 48 hours. It would last about 5 minutes. At 5:59 a.m., FBI Special Agent Byron Sage with the Crisis Negotiation Unit called inside the compound and he spoke to Steve Schneider. He told him, "We're in the process of putting tear gas into the building. This is not an assault. We will not enter the building." Steve, in response, threw the phone out of the window, which left the loudspeaker as the only means of communication between the FBI and the Branch Davidians. At dawn on Monday, April 19th, combat tanks rumbled up to the Branch Davidian complex. Byron Sage got on the loudspeaker and announced that the siege was over, but the siege was far from over. As the tanks pulled up, the voice continued over the loudspeaker. "This is not an assault. You need to come out. The siege is over." Inside, Steve Schneider ran around the compound, waking everybody up and telling them to get their gas masks. Now remember, they were supposed to carry out a gradual insertion plan for this tear gas, but there had been a clause in the briefing that Janet Reno had received and signed off on. It stated that if at any time during this operation those who were inside opened fire on the tanks, all bets were off. and tear gas would be inserted into all windows of the compound from all 4 vehicles all at once. Sounds like a really good idea. Sounds like a really good plan B. Here's what Byron Sage remembered from that fateful morning and what allegedly happened as soon as the tanks pulled up. He said, quote, "They didn't get 20 yards inside the Branch Davidian property when all hell broke loose. Gunfire began erupting from multiple positions. It was still dark out, and I could see muzzle flashes from all over the compound." So because the FBI agents claim to have been under fire as soon as they pulled up, they escalated their plan. There would no longer be a gradual step-by-step process. They were going all in. According to Janet Reno, who was watching this all go down from her television set safe and sound in Washington, she was surprised. I guessed she'd missed that clause in the fine print. But that is her fault as the Attorney General and the main decision maker in this situation. She should have done her due diligence. This was a life or death situation. People had already died. She should have read everything that she could get her hands on, more than once if you ask me. In fact, I would go so far as to say that she probably should have had a face-to-face, one-on-one meeting with representatives from the FBI to be briefed on this situation in person, not just sitting there and reading a file that the FBI had prepared for her. This way, she could have asked these questions. She could have gotten clarification on points that were a little foggy or she didn't understand. Instead, she skimmed the brief, reading only the chronology, basically getting the cliff notes, and this isn't an assumption on my part. She admitted to that later. She admitted that she hadn't read the prepared statement carefully and she hadn't read any of the supporting documentation that went along with it. At 6:02 a.m., the tanks holding the tear gas began punching holes through the walls of the Mount Carmel compound. A rush of fresh air into the building would only last a millisecond, followed by CS gas, more commonly known as tear gas. CS isn't actually a gas at all. It's a white crystalline substance that's turned into a fine mist using generators that were built into the tanks. This substance is toxic, but not usually lethal, and it causes an irritation to the mucous membranes in the eyes, mouth, nose, and lungs. Those in the vicinity will begin experiencing symptoms within 20 to 60 seconds after its introduction to their environment. It's very fast acting. They will begin crying, coughing, sneezing. They'll have difficulty breathing, experiencing a stinging in their eyes, and they may even encounter temporary blindness. As I said, it's typically not lethal, but if a person does have respiratory issues such as asthma, it can be. Skin exposure to CS can result in burns, irritation, or allergic reactions, which may require medical attention. And although this kind of chemical has often been used in war times and for riot control, the manufacturers of CS warned against using it indoors, since in confined spaces it can be very dangerous. But CS gas, it's not flammable. However, there's a difference between CS gas in the delivery that the FBI was using and military-grade tear gas canisters, which are specialized gas grenades. These canisters have advantages in an assault because they disperse the gas more quickly and they heat up to the point where they can't be picked up and thrown back outside. However, they are flammable, and later, after the compound caught fire, the FBI would deny unequivocally using these canisters. Remember that Mount Carmel was locked up tight. It had become a fortress for the Branch Davidians. They had blocked off all of the windows and doors, which would prevent anybody from sneaking in under the cover of darkness. But during the tear gas assault, it kind of also prevented them from getting out. And although the tanks had punched these huge holes in the wall, these huge holes were being blocked by even bigger tanks that were spraying a toxic gas into the building. The tanks caused absolute chaos inside of the building. They brought down the staircase that connected the first story to the second story, and they pushed debris over the trap door that led out of the compound and into the school bus that the Davidians had meant to be a shelter in case something like this happened. Now, there has been talk and questions in the future, not our future, but their future. So our past, their future. There was questions after the fact about whether the FBI had used their tanks to purposely push debris over that trapdoor, preventing anybody from getting into the shelter. There's no proof of that. What we do know is that the trapdoor that led from inside the compound to the outside, where they could then get into the school bus, was blocked because of the tanks. At approximately 12:07, the compound broke out in fire at 3 separate locations. Undoubtedly, this is the biggest question that still lingers after the fact. How did these fires start? It's important because Mount Carmel would very quickly turn into a fiery death trap that very few people would be able to escape from. So who was at fault? And we'll discuss this in detail in a moment, but Clive Doyle, who was one of the 9 Branch Davidian survivors who made it out of the compound that day, remembers that when the fire started to spread, he and some others headed for a hole in the wall that the tanks had made in the chapel. And there was this moment where they turned to each other and asked, if we escape through this hole, are we just going to be shot down? This was the mindset inside Mount Carmel that day. They knew it was no longer safe inside their home, but was it any safer outside, where FBI agents stood armed with guns? To the people who were being gassed and seemingly set ablaze by these men outside, these very same men they were supposed to surrender to, it may not have seemed like the safer alternative. They made their way towards that hole in the wall anyways, because it was their only option at this point. But as they walked away, they could hear screams coming from the building behind them. The screams of people who had been in different areas of the building more centrally located when the tanks arrived and when all hell broke loose. And Clive Doyle would walk with a heavy heart, knowing that most likely there was no escape route for these people. After the fires started, almost as if on cue, the wind picked up. Byron Sage claims that he was still pleading with Koresh, telling him, you say you're a savior, you say you're a messiah. Well, save these people, David. Bring them out of there. But many suspect that he may have been talking to himself at this point, because David Koresh was more than likely already dead. Eventually, Byron turned off his loudspeaker and watched as the building blazed. He said he was holding his breath. He said he kept waiting and hoping to see a group of children emerge from the building. But no children emerged. No miracle happened, and there was nothing that he could do. It was in God's hands now. What was it like for these people inside their home, a place that they had previously felt like was the safest place in the world, now intent on killing them, coming down around them, fire and poisonous gas everywhere they turned? For those who didn't make it out, we obviously can never really know. But from those who managed to walk out alive, we have an idea of what the experience might have been like. Here's Marjorie Thomas's account of that day. The whole entire building felt warm all at once, and then after the warmth, a thick black smoke, and the place became dark. I could hear, but I couldn't see anything. I could hear people moving and screaming, and I was still sitting down while this was happening. Then the voices faded. I was making my way out of the building because it began to get very hot, and my clothes were starting to melt on me. Before the fire had started, Sheila Martin was sitting on the step. I couldn't see her. I was making my way towards getting her, and I trod on her. I said, "I'm sorry," and her voice was very faint. I couldn't see her, and I could feel the flames. I saw a little bit of light. I made my way towards the light, and in doing so, I could see where I was, one of the bedrooms. The window was missing. I looked out. I don't like heights, but I thought, I stay inside and die, or I jump out of the window. So I put my hands over my head and I leapt out of the window. There weren't enough gas masks for everyone, and some of the gas masks weren't functioning properly, and obviously the gas masks were much too big for the smaller children. So in order to try and protect the kids and those who didn't have functioning gas masks as much as they could from the flames and the CS gas and the smoke, the Branch Davidians took rags and dipped them in water and put them over their faces and the faces of their children. These were children of all ages. Some so young they weren't even able to walk or talk yet. And as this was happening, agents outside on the loudspeaker were taunting David Koresh. "David, you've had your 15 minutes of fame. Vernon is finished. He is not your Messiah." The fire was so hot, so hungry, it spread to the flagpole, which was 25 yards away. And in a very apocalyptic way, the fire made its way up the flagpole, and set the Branch Davidian flag ablaze. To add insult to injury, even before the flames that were devouring the compound had been extinguished, a new flag had been hoisted up the pole, the ATF flag. Some might say an action such as this resulted from retribution, a silent signal that yes, the Davidians may have gotten the best of the ATF a few months ago, but now we can see who the victor is when all is said and done. So what happened to all of the people that we've gotten to know and spend time with the past few weeks? David Koresh, Wayne Martin, Steve and Judy Schneider, Rachel Jones, Michelle Jones, David Jones, the children. I went through every single autopsy report. Some of the names were familiar to me. I'd read about them, I'd learned about them. I had seen pictures of them. I read accounts from their families about what kind of people they were. Some of the names I was reading for the first time. I guess that their stories hadn't been as interesting, so they'd been lost to history. Some of the autopsy reports didn't even have names. They were unidentified. Maybe because they'd only found parts of them, maybe because their bodies were charred beyond recognition, but some of these people have been unidentified all this time. They still don't know who they were. But I felt like I knew them all, even if I didn't understand them all. Many of the Branch Davidians, like Sherry Jewell, Wayne Martin, and Michelle Jones, died from smoke inhalation, carbon monoxide poisoning, thermal burns, and severe charring. And these are terms that are used on the autopsy reports. Some of them, like Rachel Jones and Judy Schneider, died from what is listed as suffocation due to overlay and burial in a structural collapse. Still others, like Koresh and his right-hand man Steve, perished from gunshot wounds. And the children of Mount Carmel, what happened to them? The bodies of 26 children were pulled out of the collapsed compound days later when the rubble had finally cooled enough for it to be touched and sifted through. Many of these children have never been identified, such as an 11-year-old who died from blunt force trauma and a gunshot wound, and a 2-year-old who died from smoke inhalation. In some cases, only parts were found, a skull or a leg, which told the medical examiner that it had belonged to a child. Nicole and Peter Gent had been twins from Australia who had joined the Branch Davidians together. Peter had died on February 28th during the ATF raid, and Nicole perished on April 19th, along with her 2 small children, who were both fathered by David Koresh. Her son Dayland was 3, and his little sister Paige was just 1. Nicole, their mother, died from a gunshot wound to her head. She was 7 months pregnant at the time. And little Dayland, just 3 years old, was stabbed in the chest. It's unclear what happened to 1-year-old Paige. However, sifting through the autopsy reports and looking through those autopsy reports of the children who were unidentified, it's more than likely she was shot in the head as well. Based on her age and where her mother and brother were found in the compound, there was a skull of an infant female found that tells us this is most likely what happened to Paige. And this was most likely done to them by their mother before she turned the gun on herself and took her own life. Aisha Graff's 17-year-old mother to 1-year-old Startle Summers, and with another child on the way, died of carbon monoxide poisoning, smoke inhalation, and a gunshot wound to the head. 1-year-old Startle also died with her mother from smoke inhalation, and I've often wondered if maybe Startle succumbed first. Being young, only 1-year-old, small lungs, not able to handle the amount of smoke, and Aisha possibly couldn't imagine going on one more moment, not even one more moment. So she took her own life, hoping that she would be reunited with her daughter in the heavenly kingdom that David Koresh had promised them all. Mayana Schneider, the tiny little daughter of Judy Schneider and David Koresh, died with her mother, suffocating due to the building collapse. Michelle Jones, her 4-year-old daughter Serenity C. Jones, and her 2-year-old twin daughters, fondly called Chica and Little One, all died from smoke inhalation. Rachel and her 3 children, Cyrus, who was 8, Star, who was 6, and Bobby Lane, who was 2, all died with their mother, either from suffocation due to the building crashing down around them or from smoke inhalation. 6 women died together in the underground tunnel passage that led from the compound to the school bus. They died because they went in this tunnel hoping to get out, get to the school bus, which they'd made and buried specifically for this reason, but the tunnel was blocked. The trap door was blocked. by the FBI. So they couldn't get out, and they suffocated when the smoke and the carbon monoxide followed them down that tunnel. Of all these people that died that day, 20 died from gunshot wounds. It's believed that these were mercy killings or suicides, knowing that there was no way out and that they were going to a better place. And with any story like this, you're going to have things that are true and things that are false. And it's hard to figure out which ones are true and which ones are false. And there's rumors, and there are people who have said since that the FBI shot these people. And I don't believe that. First of all, the bullets don't match, the calibers don't match, and I don't believe that. Most of these people were shot in the head or through the mouth, with the exception of one person who was shot in the back. That may have been from enemy fire, but otherwise I think that it was the Branch Davidians figuring that this was what it had all been leading up to, and this was what was supposed to happen. So they just didn't want their children or themselves or their friends to suffer, because dying in a fire is incredibly painful. David Koresh and Steve Schneider were found together in the same room next to each other, and it's believed that Steve Schneider shot David Koresh and then turned the gun on himself. Most likely it was something that they had agreed on prior to the fact. But I have always wondered if Steve Schneider was just so over it by now. So over the fact that David Koresh was the one who had gotten them in this position, that he had stolen his wife and gotten her pregnant. If at the end he was just like, all right, well, I've been wanting to do this for 9 years. 9 people walked out of Mount Carmel alive that day. 4 had severe burns, including Marjorie Thomas, who had jumped out of the second floor window while she was on fire. Still, once she was out, she had to be restrained by the agents from going back inside the compound as she tried to return to the burning building. She was admitted to the hospital, and she suffered from burns to 50% of her body. Clive Doyle also made it out, as did David Thibodeau, Jamie Castillo, and an older woman named Ruth Riddle. When these people walked out of the building, they were immediately apprehended by FBI agents. They were told to lay on their stomachs, and their hands were tied behind them with zip ties. And as these people who were laying on their stomachs on the ground, after having been a witness to, in some cases, their family and friends dying, they looked up and they saw that burning building, and I imagine what they saw was very apocalyptic in many ways to them. Fire, smoke, and a legion of armed men watching as a building burned with their family and friends inside. According to David Thibodeau, the survivors were then driven to a checkpoint where they were handed over to the ATF. The ATF then brought them to another checkpoint where they brought them inside of a tent and had them stripped down. They searched them, and they recorded this all for posterity, I suppose. They were then ordered to put on orange jumpsuits. They were fingerprinted, and they were handcuffed at the hands and ankles. They were then handed over to the Texas Rangers for questioning. Many of them lawyered up. A lot of them had to go to the hospital and get their burns treated and their, respiratory issues treated. And apparently the first order of business after all of this happened was to bring 11 Branch Davidians to trial, essentially, for what happened at the raid in February. They were charged with attempted murder of federal officers, conspiracy to murder federal officers, aiding and abetting the murder of federal officers, murdering federal officers, and several other gun offenses. I'm not going to talk about this trial in great detail because we have bigger fish to fry. What you should know, though, is the judge in that case, after hearing the evidence from both sides, told the jury before they deliberated, quote, "If a defendant was not an aggressor and had reasonable grounds to believe that he was in imminent danger of death or serious bodily harm from which he could save himself only by using deadly force against his assailants, he had the right to employ deadly force in order to defend himself." Now, the jurors found all 11 not guilty of murder or conspiracy to commit murder. However, they found 7 of them guilty of aiding and abetting in the voluntary manslaughter of federal officials. 5 of them additionally guilty of carrying a firearm during the commission of a crime of violence, and 3 of them, including Clive Doyle, were found innocent and charged with nothing. But there was a problem with this verdict. The judge was like, well, you said they're not guilty of the first count, which was conspiracy to murder a federal agent, yet you say they are guilty of the third count, which was carrying a firearm during the commission of a crime of violence. But if you believe number 3, you kind of have to believe number 1 because they go together. So either you don't believe number 1 and then you can't believe number 3, or you believe both. Do you believe both? In the end, those who were charged with the third count, which was carrying the weapon during the commission of a violent act, those charges were dropped. When June of 1994 rolled around and the 7 defendants who remained in custody stood before the judge and were sentenced, 5 of them got 40 years. Ruth Riddle, who they hadn't been able to even prove she'd had a gun at any point, only got 5 years, and Graham Craddock got 20 years. And these seem like harsh sentences, but the judge made these decisions with the belief of 2 things: that in the February ATF attack, the first fire had come from inside the compound, and in the April attack, the Branch Davidians had set fire to their own compound. And we've already talked about how we're not quite sure who fired that first shot in February, but something interesting to note is that the front doors of Mount Carmel, where that first gunfire went down, those doors are missing. Mount Carmel had a pair of hollow-cut steel front doors, and remember that attorney Dick DeGuerin had gone to Mount Carmel after February and before April when the whole building burned down, and he'd seen the bullet holes in that door. He would later testify that there was only bullets on one side of this door, the right side, and that the bullet holes were coming from the outside in. And this should be very easy to prove, right? I mean, it's a steel-cut front door. It's probably not going to be completely destroyed by the fire. So just get the door, and then we can see what kind of bullet holes are in there and where they're coming from. But those front doors from Mount Carmel have completely disappeared. They're not in the evidence that came from the compound after it burned down. They're nowhere to be found. Where'd the door go? Where's the door? Now we'll talk about the fire. Who set the fire? Well, the FBI's position is that when they had sent those recording devices or bugs into Mount Carmel in the milk crates, they'd heard Branch Davidian conversation, which centered around setting fires to the compound on David Koresh's instructions. They were talking about what they should be pouring the fuel on, when they should set it, what time, how it should happen. And they did this very openly. The Davidians had also brought up fire several times while they were talking to the FBI negotiators. They didn't have electricity because the FBI had cut it off. They used Coleman lanterns and candles to read by or just function by. And this pretty much meant that Mount Carmel, which for some reason was full of hay bales and just made out of untreated plywood, it was a tinderbox. And Steve Schneider had mentioned this to an FBI negotiator at one point, and the negotiator had said, well, do you guys have fire hydrants? And Steve said, I think we have one. And the FBI negotiator said, well, y'all better get yourself some fire insurance. So, I mean, it looks bad for both of them. It looks bad for both the FBI and the Branch Davidians, since fire just seemed to be a theme that both of them brought up and talked about. However, fire is a very biblical kind of thing. In Corinthians 3:13, it says, their work will show for what it is, because the day will bring it to light. It will be revealed with fire, and fire will test the quality of each person's work. Exodus 19:18 says, Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. And Luke 3:16 says, I baptized you with water, but one who is more powerful than I will come, the straps of whose sandals I am not worthy to untie. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and fire. So in my humble opinion, knowing what I know, knowing that the fire broke out in 3 separate places on the compound or in the compound, almost simultaneously, knowing that there was audio of the Davidians discussing setting fire to the compound before the fire started, I believe that yes, the Branch Davidians did start these 3 fires. However, as with everything else in this story, in this case, in life, it's not that simple. After the fire, Janet Reno was praised in the media and by her peers and colleagues. On April 19th, Reno took full responsibility for the decision to ultimately use tear gas at Mount Carmel. She said that the FBI had considered every possible option and had moved carefully, but she hadn't anticipated that an attempt to ratchet up the pressure on the compound would provoke such a violent response from the Branch Davidians. FBI Director William Sessions also threw his opinion in, claiming that the Bureau had misjudged Koresh, that they'd been told by him and their team of psychologists and experts that he did not intend for a mass suicide. He stated, yes, it is a surprise that he would do it. Janet Reno and Jeff Sessions' willingness to take responsibility for what happened that day apparently wowed everyone. They were just so impressed that these people were able to admit they had made mistakes. But did they really? Did they really take responsibility? For Janet Reno to say that she had no idea that an effort to ratchet up pressure inside Mount Carmel would cause the Davidians to fight back, it's ridiculous. She's either lying or she didn't do her due diligence before giving the green light to gas an entire community of men, women, and children. Multiple times, the FBI negotiators told the FBI HRT team that continuing to push these people would result in nothing good. The religious experts that the Bureau had brought in also said much of the same. They said that if Koresh truly believed he was Jesus Christ, this was really going to end in only one way, a martyr's death. As soon as they set their sights on David Koresh, the ATF and all the people who lived in Waco, including local law enforcement, knew that the Branch Davidians were, in a way, a doomsday cult, a doomsday group. They called their home Ranch Apocalypse. What about any of that information left Reno or Sessions unclear about the ultimate goal of David Koresh? And while we're on the topic, did the Branch Davidians plan to end it all for themselves? Was that always their end goal? Once again, ultimately, it depends on who you ask. All the survivors claim that this was never their intention. But you really have to exercise some critical thinking when you look at this question. I think it was the plan for some of them. With anything, you're going to have varying levels of interest and loyalty and passion. Two people can be fans of the same movie, but one person watches this movie several times a day, 7 days a week. This person has memorized and is able to quote full parts of the movie. And they use this movie as a way to almost decipher and explain their own life, while this other person really loves the movie too, considers it to be their favorite movie, but, they have it on DVD and they saw it in the movie theater a couple of times, and now they have a movie poster that hangs in their basement, and that's pretty much it. Both of these people claim that they love this movie, that it's their favorite movie. However, one may be a little bit more into it than the other. I believe that David Koresh had followers who had different levels of intensity when it came to believing what he was preaching to them. If they had all planned on dying on that compound, there would be no survivors. No one would have tried to get out, and just the fact that there were so many people who did, the 9 survivors, of course, and then, of course, the 6 women who were clearly trying to get out of the compound and go to the shelter. They didn't want to die. They were trying to get out, but they were suffocated in the tunnel because the FBI blocked the trap door. To me, this is evidence that not all the Branch Davidians were on the same page, just like not all the FBI were on the same page. So yes, maybe some of them, the ride or die David Koresh followers, they were probably on board for it and they were fine with it. But there was so many more who didn't want to die. That wasn't their end goal. That wasn't their plan. They were trying to defend themselves and they were trying to escape. And to me, that doesn't show that the entire compound of people wanted to just die, because if they had wanted that, they would have just sat there and let the FBI come, or they would have set the compound on fire and just sat there peacefully while it took them away. They wouldn't have been running around screaming, using gas masks, putting wet rags over their face, trying to escape. And I don't like how Janet Reno used her lack of understanding or knowledge as a justification for making a really stupid and dangerous mistake. I didn't know or I wasn't informed enough is never a justification when it is your one job to ensure that you're putting in the work and the research to know everything about the situation you're making a life or death decision on. She was a lawyer. She was a lawyer for many years. Does she not know how to thoroughly fact check something? Additionally, like David Koresh, the government would change their stance as time went on, depending on what they needed people to think or what they needed to support the end result or the end story that they wanted people to believe. First, they said they had no clue that these people would do this to themselves. Later, when everybody questioned them and they were like, what the heck, how did this happen? How did these people die? How did you stand by and let it happen? They were like, well, I mean, it was a doomsday call, like if people really want to kill themselves, we can't stop them. And probably what I found to be one of the most tactless and cold-hearted government responses came directly from the President of the United States. Bill Clinton said, quote, "Surprise would be a mild word to say that anyone who would suggest that the Attorney General should resign because some religious fanatics murdered themselves." Some religious fanatics murdered themselves. Even if that's true, and I don't believe that it 100% is, the children who died that day, they weren't religious fanatics, and they didn't murder themselves. They were too young to be religious fanatics, too young to make decisions for themselves, too young to really even know what the heck was going on. Clinton should never have said that, and of course, right after, he was like, oh crap, that was kind of cold-hearted, that was kind of savage, and he tried backpedaling, and he was like, obviously, I feel really bad, but when somebody says something like that, when their backs are to a wall, when they're being accused of something, which he and Janet Reno were both being accused of making a stupid decision, what they say when they're trying to defend themselves initially, it's usually what they actually feel and what they believe. So I think he actually felt and believed that. And when a person's first reaction is self-preservation, whether it be for the individual or the entity that the individual represents, we're losing our humanity and the ability to understand that not everything that happens in life is black and white. In fact, very little happens in life that is black and white. I believe Clinton, Reno, Sessions, the whole lot of them were so interested in coming out of this without having the finger pointed at them, without any blame resting on their shoulders. They failed to recognize and represent the very real loss that was suffered. Not just by those who lost their lives, but by the United States as a whole. When we can't protect the innocent, when we're making excuses and generalizations to justify the unjust, we're turning our backs on the very thing that we claim makes us an evolved species, the ability to be compassionate, the ability to put ourselves in others' shoes. And if the Branch Davidians were the ones that started the fire, the tactics the FBI used ensured that very few people would walk out alive, that everything would be destroyed, even in some cases, valuable evidence. That might unequivocally point to huge, glaring mistakes on behalf of the ATF and the FBI. Allegedly, that's just my opinion. I think fire destroys things, and if there was evidence in the fire, it would have been destroyed. That's just, a supposition. I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I never do. It was the FBI's position that they had not used any chemicals that were flammable or could have potentially acted as an accelerant to the fire. And the CS gas that they had sprayed into the compound in that form, it wasn't flammable. This was their story, and they were sticking to it, and for 6 years, that was the generally wide-held belief. Why would they lie? After the Senate hearing on April 23rd, where everyone patted Janet Reno on the back for taking responsibility, a poll showed that 72% of those questioned believed the FBI had done the right thing, and 95% aligned themselves with Clinton in blaming David Koresh and the Branch Davidians for their ultimate end. ATF Director Stephen Higgins also spoke at the Senate hearing, and his assertions that he believed his agency had done nothing wrong infuriated people because he wasn't being a good boy and taking responsibility, not like Janet Reno. So Senator Phil Gramm of Texas at the hearing or the meeting, he said, "I don't think we're going to achieve anything by pointing fingers here and trying to figure out who's responsible for what." Why will we not achieve anything? What are you talking about? Isn't that what happens when almost 100 people are dead? You have to figure out who's to blame. You have to figure out who did it. And what we achieve in doing so is called justice. If multiple people, not even 100 people or almost 100 people, like 15 people, multiple people were killed by some unknown assailant, would Senator Phil Gramm be like, you know what, what's the point in trying to figure out who did this? You know, what's that going to achieve? We don't need to point fingers. No. The only reason all of these politicians are sitting around being like, well, you know, she took responsibility. It's done. We don't have to figure out exactly what happened or exactly who's to blame. The only reason they're doing that is because it involves one of their own. And honestly, Republican, Democrat, whoever you are, at the end of the day, you're still going to support a fellow politician. It's just kind of like that boys club thing. And I do feel, let me offshoot quickly, I feel like Janet Reno came into the Attorney General position being the first female Attorney General of all time, in history. And she felt that need to keep up with that boys club. She felt like she couldn't show sympathy or empathy for the Branch Davidians, that she couldn't be soft or go easy on them, because then you'd have all these people saying, well, we can't have a woman be an attorney general because she doesn't know how to handle, problems like this, and she goes soft. So I think that she was like, yeah, I guess use the tear gas, because all of these men were around her, probably mansplaining to her like, okay, honey, you have to understand, these people bad, us good. Good people take out bad people. Okay, honey, do you understand what I'm saying? She probably had all these men around her, like, being respectful, but really subtly downplaying her ability to make intelligent decisions when it comes to things like this. That's the way I picture it. Just my opinion, don't come for me, or do. I think I'm right. Would have loved to have been a fly on that wall. If it had been anybody else, every single one of these politicians would have been calling for a full hearing, but since the interrogation light was focused on the government, they were all like, well, why are we pointing fingers? We don't need to point fingers. But within a very short time, Janet Reno and Bill Clinton's popularity with the American public would steadily decline. And there's a lot of reasons for this, and I don't want this video to be too long, so I won't go into those now, but you can look it up. There's a lot of reasons why Reno and Clinton kind of fell out of favor with the U.S. public. And this question of Waco would come back up. Were they both aware of what was happening at all times with the Branch Davidian rage and the Branch Davidian situation? Was this an honest mistake, or did it come from negligence? In August of 1995, a White House panel was put together to once again examine Clinton's role in what happened at Waco. Republican Representative from New Hampshire, Bill Zelliff, had caused quite a stir when he alleged that President Clinton had been closely involved in planning the raid that ended the siege in April of 1993. Now, after Zelliff was criticized by some of his colleagues for making these comments in what they said was an irresponsible way with the intention of causing problems, he responded that he had evidence not only of White House involvement, but of their efforts after to cover it up. He said, quote, "If everyone really wants, and all have said they do, the chips to fall where they may, then let's not begin bellyaching when they start to fall." Thank you. It was logical to think that since Janet Reno had only been an attorney general for 38 days when she had to make that decision about Waco, that Bill Clinton, the president who had appointed her and said he believed in her, he probably would have been mentoring her in some way. This was a very big decision. She was literally on the job for 38 days. One would assume that a responsible president would most likely give his attorney general some advice or some counsel, or, at least be with her during this first big crisis that was happening. And not just because she was a woman, obviously. I don't believe that a woman needs any more help than a man, but because she was new to the job. But after 7 hours of testimony, Janet Reno seemed to have everybody convinced that this decision had been 100% solely hers without any interference or help from Bill Clinton. She didn't take 100% of the responsibility, of course. Don't get it twisted and think that she was like, this is completely 100% my fault. She's never done that, really. But she didn't blame him at all. She made it very clear and was very insistent that he had nothing to do with it. In my opinion, I think she took a bullet for him. I think that she was probably grateful. I mean, this is your boss, you're not going to testify against your boss in court. I think she was grateful to him for the opportunity she'd gotten to be Attorney General. She wasn't really qualified for it. And she was probably hoping for his support in future endeavors. So no, she's not going to throw the President of the United States under the bus she's going to have his back and know that he's going to take care of her later because I scratch your back, you scratch mine. That's how politics works, unfortunately. And Janet Reno never wavered from her statements until the day she died. So it may be true, but either way, doesn't that still make Bill Clinton negligent in one way or the other? Negligent if he gave her counsel that caused her to make that decision without either of them reading the brief thoroughly, or negligent because this was somebody who was brand new and probably should have had somebody with them in their first big kind of decision-making process. In my opinion, yes, he's at fault in some way. He's the president of the United States. When something happens that's bad in the United States that he was aware of, you're kind of at fault. If you want to be the head of the country, then you've got to take responsibility for every single person that lives in this country. But this wouldn't be the end of Janet Reno having to discuss Waco. Bill Zelliff made an observation during that 1995 panel, and he said that, Koresh was the bomb, but we, the government, we lit the fuse. And he really had no idea how accurate that statement was. In 1999, 6 years after Mount Carmel went up in flames, new evidence emerged, suggesting that the FBI had been outright lying when they said they'd never used flammable chemicals when they'd attacked the compound. A videotape emerged that had been made by a surveillance plane that was flying over the compound at this time, and this plane had been equipped with an infrared scanner. On this tape, FBI Supervisor Stephen McGavin can be heard requesting authorization to use military-issue pyrotechnic grenades after the original tear gas had been inserted into the compound, but it had failed to penetrate the structure's plywood roof. On the ground, the special agent in charge of the HRT, Richard Rogers, quickly approved this request. Now, 9 days later, both Rogers and Sessions sat in front of a congressional committee and swore up and down they had not used any flammable tear gas, and that there was no way anything they had done would start or contribute to a fire. Now, this new evidence was a problem for the general public who had believed Janet Reno and the FBI for the better part of 6 years. And it raised, obviously, other questions. How many people in the FBI knew about the flammable rounds being used and had just lied about it for so long? Did Janet Reno or Bill Clinton know? They should have been watching and paying attention and listening from Washington on their CCTV, which was connected to the FBI agents when they were at Mount Carmel. The FBI also asserted that they had never fired a single shot when they took over the Branch Davidian, issue and conflict. The ATF had obviously taken part in some gunfire, but the FBI claimed they never shot a single bullet. But there is some evidence that suggests otherwise. These aerial videos were analyzed by a company called Infraspection. This company had spotted blips of light on the video that they determined to be gunfire, but 60 Minutes, who'd hired the company, decided they were not going to run with the story at that time. So a man named Carlos Gigliotti took over the analysis of the video, and in 1999, he was retained by the House Government Reform Committee, who had decided, after this new information of deceit on behalf of the FBI, to look into Waco again. Now, Carlos claimed that even though the FBI said they were giving out first-generation VHS tapes for labs to analyze, they had been giving out digitized versions, copies. This is important as a first generation can't be altered, changed, or edited, because then it wouldn't be a first generation anymore, but a subsequent copy obviously can be. Digitizing files also compresses the images and loses fine detail, so Carlos made a fuss, and because he had the House Government Reform Committee in his corner, he was able to get the original tape, and then he was able to decipher figures from the FBI on that tape shooting guns as they rushed the compound. But just before the trial, on April 28, 2000, Carlos Gigliotti was found dead in his lab. He hadn't been seen in weeks, he hadn't been reported missing, and he was a fairly healthy 42-year-old man. There was no signs of a break-in or a struggle. It was clean, too clean, almost. Along with preparing a report for the House committee, Carlos had also been advising lawyers who were representing the families of the dead Branch Davidians in a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the government. On March 28th, he wrote a letter to the lead attorney on the case in which he said, quote, "I still have a lot of shocking evidence to show you." He had also spoken to a friend of his, a reporter at the Washington Post, in March, and claimed, I've solved the case. I know exactly what happened. And he asked his friend to come to his lab so he could show him the tapes and explain everything in person. Before he had died, Carlos had spent countless hours poring over those videotapes, and he had concluded that he'd counted 57 shots coming from outside the compound inn. He also saw 7 unknown subjects by the rubble at the back of the collapsed structure by the water tanks. He believed that these were FBI snipers. It's unclear why Carlos died, although the cause of death was listed as natural causes. He had some Theraflu packets in his living room, and it's suspected he wasn't feeling well before his death, but at his funeral, 5 men in dark suits sat in the back, and when the service was over, they simultaneously rose and left together, never speaking a word to anyone. No one in Carlos's family or circle of friends knew who these men in black were. So after this new evidence emerged, right, there's a new investigation into what happened at Waco, and Janet Reno appoints Senator John Danforth, and he creates this report, which is now known as the Danforth Report, which he accumulated after all of this investigation, allegedly. It unsurprisingly ended with the ATF and the FBI being absolved of any wrongdoing. It also stated 5 important things. Government agents did not set fire to the compound on April 19th. Government agents did not shoot at the Branch Davidians on April 19th. Government agents did not use the U.S. military improperly. There was no evidence of a cover-up, and the blame for the entire thing was placed firmly on the shoulders of David Koresh and his followers. Now, I would have no knowledge as to whether or not John Danforth was biased when he was writing his final report. I do know that he had proof that the FBI lied about using pyrotechnic rounds that day. They blatantly lied about it, and to me, that's a cover-up. But he theorized that this wasn't a cover-up. He said basically they weren't really knowledgeable about how these rounds worked or what they did, what they could cause. So it was more like they were just stupid. I'm sorry, it's ridiculous. So basically, he would rather have you think that the FBI is just a whole bunch of bumbling idiots who don't know how to use military weapons, rather than you think anything nefarious happened, that you might think that the FBI would lie to you, or that they aren't telling the truth all the time. He'd rather have you think they were idiots than liars, I guess. It's crazy to me. But then wouldn't that be negligence or even homicide, even if it was unintentional, if you used weapons against people that you didn't know how they worked or you didn't know what they were going to do and those people died? Doesn't that make you guilty of their deaths because something that you did resulted in their death? If I threw a grenade into somebody's house and it killed everybody in there, and then I was like, oh, well, grenades blow up? What? I had no idea. I never would have thrown it in there. I'm still going to go to prison for the rest of my life. Like, it's bananas to me. It's bananas. Additionally, when the Texas Rangers went to Mount Carmel after April 19th, they found several shell casings from weapons that the FBI used. Now, when the Bureau was asked to explain themselves, the ATF came forward and said they'd used those kinds of weapons in the past, in February, when they'd been there attacking the Branch Davidians, and that's probably how they'd ended up there, but many still question where the metal door went. The front door that had been the location of the original shootout. The Texas Rangers combed through pounds and pounds of evidence, but that door, it just wasn't there. There's so much more we could talk about in relation to this story. The story of these people and the lives they lived, why this all happened, but we just don't have the time. I've taken enough of your time with the series as it is, but I do want to talk about certain events that followed and how Waco and Ruby Ridge were dominoes in a line of events that had been set into motion. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. The ATF and the FBI may have thought they were doing what was right. They may have thought they were just eliminating a threat and that they were justified in doing so. We can't lie, though, it was a show of force. It was a message not only to the Branch Davidians or to the Weaver family, but to everyone in the country who may have held similar beliefs or considered doing similar things. We always win. We always conquer, and if you try to come up against us, your home will be left in a pile of smoking rubble. The only thing that will be left after is our flag flying victoriously overhead. I believe that they wanted people to be scared, to be warned to stay in line or else, but that's not necessarily what happened because the tragedy would ripple out and become the catalyst to more tragedy. In 1995, an ex-Army soldier and security guard named Timothy McVeigh parked a rented Ryder truck in front of the Alfred P. Murray Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City. At 9:02 a.m., the truck exploded, reducing a third of the building to rubble. 168 people died that day, including 19 children. Initially, people were not thinking Waco when this happened. They were thinking of another event that happened in February of 1993 when a truck bomb had been detonated below the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. This terrorist attack had been planned with the intention of bringing the North Tower down into the South Tower and taking thousands of lives. Fortunately, the plan failed, but many were still injured and 6 people died. Obviously, the FBI was surprised to find that the perpetrator of the Oklahoma City bombing was an American citizen, an ex-soldier even, and it was hard to imagine what his motives could have been. Timothy McVeigh had an intense distrust for government in general, not just his. He avidly watched all over the world as countries mistreated their citizens and abused their power. Then Ruby Ridge happened, and he wondered if the United States was starting to do the same. If he had any questions in his mind, they were quickly answered when Waco happened. He became enraged. He traveled to Waco after the ATF raid to stand with other supporters of the Second Amendment during the standoff to see what would happen next. He handed out flyers, and he sold pro-gun and anti-government bumper stickers. And when Mount Carmel went up in flames, he knew he'd been right all along, and he warned those around him that any one of them could be next. If there was ever any doubts that Waco was the main catalyst for Timothy McVeigh's future actions, the date of his attack in Oklahoma City loudly puts them to rest. April 19th, 1995, exactly 2 years after the Branch Davidians lost their lives. Was McVeigh right or justified in his actions? Of course not. Was David Koresh right or justified in some of his actions? No. But 2 wrongs never make a right, and many people view the government as a parental unit almost. They watch and they monitor, and when those in their care make mistakes, they dole out punishment. But they should always have our best interests at heart. And they should always be focused on rehabilitation, giving people a chance to make mistakes and learn from them and come back better and stronger than ever. That, in the end, will make a stronger and better country. What were those people at Mount Carmel supposed to learn that day? That if you mess with the bull, you get the horns? And when will those in power begin to recognize that even though they are in power and they get away with a hell of a lot that other people wouldn't be getting away with, there's still consequences. The Oklahoma City bombing was a consequence of what happened at Waco. And I'm sure the ATF and the FBI and Janet Reno and Sessions and Clinton, they didn't intend for such a horrific thing to happen. But that's where being a good politician and being a good person comes in handy. The ability to think ahead. The ability to ask oneself, how is this thing that I'm doing now going to affect me, others in my area, my community, my world? Today, on the land where the Branch Davidians once lived and prayed together, memorials stand to remember them. Some Davidians rebuilt the church and continue to worship there. And as always, the group is splintered, divided between certain beliefs that they do not share. A man named Charles Pace, who refers to himself as the teacher of righteousness and has been a part of the group since the days of Ben and Lois Roden, claims that he doesn't follow Koresh's twisted view of the Bible, but he and his group are still waiting for the end times. He told NPR, quote, "The United States has to fall in order for the one world order to be set up, especially if there's a war in the Middle East. That's when you're going to start seeing Branch Davidians scramble out to find out what the truth is and where they need to be." He took an old barn and rehabilitated it, and he turned it into a chapel where he gives sermons, mostly to empty chairs. In 2013, NPR reported that survivors Clive Doyle and Sheila Martin, who lost their families in the fire, still worship every Saturday at Mount Carmel, and they're waiting for Koresh to be resurrected. The land doesn't belong to any one person. It belongs to the church. Therefore, anyone who claims to be a Branch Davidian can set up shop there, and they have. So Clive Doyle set up like his trailer there, and he would give sermons and everything out of it. And then 300 yards away, you've got Charles Pace. And Charles and Clive, it seems like they get along okay. They don't really intermingle too much, but they're friendly. They're neighbors, pretty much. And even the former wife of George Roden lived there for a while and tried to become the head of the church. In 1994, she made a public announcement that she was not going to let Koresh's faction take over the land, the Branch Davidian complex, take over the religion, essentially, ever again. And she invited everybody who was a Branch Davidian to come there in October for a week-long celebration, and then they could choose for themselves who they wanted to lead them. The Rodens really like challenging people to things. I just imagine it being kind of like a Hogwarts game where, you know, Hermione and Ron and Harry are battling against the Slytherins to see who can do the most magic with their wands. Like, that's what I think of. But that's what she wanted. That's what she expected people to do. Clive Doyle and Amo Roden went head to head, and they were both suing each other for the keys to the castle, but they were essentially told they had to share and coexist. Of course, with battling ideologies, they could not, and Roden left in 2001, later being stopped for questioning at the site of the Oklahoma City bombing because she was driving a truck that was plastered with signs and bumper stickers that showed Mount Carmel in flames, accompanied by the words, "Waco, Texas, and Oklahoma City are where the one world government shot itself in the foot." Law enforcement obviously pulled her over because they were afraid she was another terrorist, intending on causing more harm and more death, but she was eventually released. Now, Mount Carmel attracts dozens of tourists every year. They stroll around the property and they ponder what happened there. Glimpses of those who once lived there are everywhere on the 77-acre property, with only plaques to signify what used to stand. It now looks like a wasted battlefield. Ron Goines, the caretaker at Mount Carmel, claims he lives with the ghosts of the Branch Davidians every day. He told TexasMonthly.com, "I hear children laughing. Of course, I hear other things too, like dogs. I figure the dogs are real, but the children aren't. Walking the property, all of a sudden, I'm blanketed by a cold chill, as if I'm being watched or somebody's got a gun on me." I don't follow party line politics. I like to be able to pick and choose from each side what I agree with and what I want to support. I'm also a realist, and I understand and recognize that the government has secrets they would like to keep. And that's fine. It's fine with me, because I question everything. Therefore, I can never really be lied to because I don't believe anything until I've investigated it and proven it for myself. I live in the world as it is, not as I wish it was. Of course, the ideal situation would be that any person in this world can trust without question what their government tells them and says to them. But that's not the real world, and to be honest, it never will be, because politics calls to a certain type of personality. A narcissistic personality, an egocentric personality, a self-serving personality. Essentially, they all have a motive. They all have an agenda. Anything you could say about any president could be said about them all. Selfish? Check. Power hungry? Check. Money hungry? Check. They're all that way. They were all that way. Some of them more than others, or maybe some of them just hit it better than others. And I'm not mad at them. I don't hate them. I don't judge them. And as long as we understand that we need to use our own brains to analyze and research what we're told in the end, we will never be left ignorant. There's a difference between being ignorant and stupid. Stupidity suggests that you don't know. You don't have the ability to know, and that maybe you don't really even want to know. Ignorance suggests that you don't know, but you have the ability to know. It's not an insult, nor is it a constant state. It just means you're in the dark. But you don't need to be, not if you take things into your own hands. The question that remains, in my mind at least, is why did these people stay with David Koresh when they knew and saw things were going downhill? Our good friend David Thibodeau can possibly give us some insight into this. He says, quote, "To me, these omens signified that events would definitely end badly, and soon. Oddly enough, I was exhilarated by that possibility. I'd been in this for a couple years now, just waiting for this stuff to happen. Let them come. At last, the prophecies might be fulfilled, providing a kind of confirmation that we had been true to David's teachings and hadn't put up with the hardships of life for nothing. I was in a state of mind where I was hoping something, anything would happen. Despite my terror, I wanted to share their common fate. And this was the state of mind that Koresh wanted his people to be in. Imagine doing the same thing every day, eating the same food every day, seeing the same people every day. It would have been the most structured and uncomfortable routine in the entire world. But then in these prophecies and these sermons that you're hearing every day, there's excitement. There's angels and fire and God and judgment and heralds harking or what have you, but it's exciting, right? Way more exciting than anything you've done all day. Their senses were dulled. During their day-to-day, they felt no anticipation, no joy, no excitement. They did nothing spontaneous, and some would say that all these things are what makes life worth living, right? The ability to see new things, go different places, meet new people. All these crazy, unexpected places that we sometimes find ourselves in our lives, they had none of that. What they had to look forward to was the end of the world, so it's no surprise that they would have been eager to see it come as soon as possible. For someone like David Thibodeau, who is not particularly religious, for him it was a loyalty to the people who had become his family, who'd shared his uncomfortable circumstances and who he'd truly come to love and respect. And at the end of the day, I know we've spent the entire series of videos picking apart every little mistake that the Branch Davidians or the ATF or the FBI made. But let's try not to judge the Branch Davidians or the ATF or the FBI too harshly. When the Davidians were inside that compound with the flames blazing around them, what did they tell their children? What would you have told your children? That everything was going to be okay, that God will protect them, that you love them? And when the wives of the ATF agents who lost their lives had to go home and tell their children what happened to their father, what did they tell their children? What would you have told your children? That their daddy loved them, that he's gone, but they'll be together again soon, that he was just doing his job. David Koresh was a bad man, period, and I don't think he's ever denied that. He proudly broadcasted his sinner status, and the Branch Davidians did have illegal automatic weapons. Do I think that they ever would have used them on the government if the government hadn't come looking for a fight? Of course not. I definitely don't. Because Koresh wasn't telling his people that the forces of good were going to go looking for a fight with the forces of evil. He said the forces of good had to defend themselves against the possible attack from the forces of evil. But I do believe that the children needed to be removed from that place. It was no place for children inside that compound. I tried to look at this from both perspectives. I tried to see the mistakes and the humanity on both sides. I think I understand why everyone did what they did. And I don't think that the blame lies with any one person or any one group. Koresh started it, the government finished it, and history should see the both of them carry the weight and the guilt and the responsibility. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. Let me know what you thought about this series, if you enjoyed it, if you liked the cult series, if it bored you, if you weren't interested. I want to know all the good, the bad, and the ugly, because that is always what I will give you. Thank you guys so much for being here. Stay kind and stay beautiful. I got a lot of cool videos coming up, and I will see you next time. Bye.
Battle's going straight down, and that river runs deep, the mountains get steep, and the voices getting too loud. All these feelings I've buried, it's looking like a cemetery.